Well, welcome to week 5 of our class, The Final Days of Jesus. We have now for 4 weeks and then today walked through the most important week of the last week of the most important week of the most important man who's ever lived, right? This is the last days of Jesus. We've started in Sunday and have gone now through half of Friday. So in week 4, we covered half of Friday. And today we're going to pick up at the back half of Friday and really cover the death of Jesus up until the burial of Jesus. And then we'll save Saturday and Sunday for week 6. We talk about the resurrection. And so today we're going to talk about what we normally call Good Friday, sort of the death of Jesus, the most important death of anybody in the history of the planet. This death is central to Christian faith. The death and the resurrection of Jesus is what makes everything that we do real and true. That Jesus, if he had not died and risen from the grave, would not be worth following 2,000 years later. And so the death of Jesus is central to Christian faith. And so it's a really important text that we're going to look at as we look at what all 4 Gospels tell us as we move through these things. So if you remember, last week we covered the trial of Jesus, right? That Jesus has been brought to first Caiaphas' father-in-law, and then has this trial with Caiaphas, and then early in the morning the Sanhedrin declare him guilty. They have to wait until sunrise in order to render their verdict. And so today we're going to pick up where they have to send him away. They have to send him to Pilate in order to get what's done, what they need done. So we're going to look at, I'll just throw this up here. Again, I'll remind you, you will see these are all the text, the sort of sections we're going to cover today. You can always see this in the PDF if you're on the app, if you're on YouTube, wherever you're watching this. You just look and click down below. You'll find a PDF where you'll see this exact keynote, and you'll see it probably more clearly than you might be able to on the screen. So I'll remind you, we'll return to this slide throughout, but I'll remind you this is sort of where we're moving. And so at the end of week 4, we covered the final verdict from the Sanhedrin that Jesus was worthy of death. Now remember, Jews have some self-governance, but they're still ultimately under the Romans, and the Romans would not allow them to execute men. So if they want Jesus to be executed, they're going to have to send him to the Romans. And so we're going to cover the Roman trial of Jesus. We've covered the Jewish trial of Jesus, which really takes 3 phases. First with Pilate, second with Herod Antipas, and then a third one back with Pilate for the final verdict. So if we sort of look at, and this is just the sort of the main map that we've been looking at. We looked at last week. If you'll remember here, they come from the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is taken. He's taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Right, that is where this verdict that from early Friday morning is rendered, that Jesus is worthy of death. Now, because the Jews can't execute Jesus, they then have to send him. So if you sort of see this picture right here, they then have to send him from the palace of the high priest, which is probably here, to the palace of Herod the Great, which is where Pilate is staying as he's in town for the Passover. They send him to there. Now, Pilate's the governor of Judea. He served as the governor from AD 26 to AD 36. He was appointed by Emperor Tiberius, who served from AD 14 to AD 37. Now, Christ was either crucified in AD 30 or AD 33. I think AD 33, for reasons we've already talked about in this class and that Kostenberger covers in his book. I think 33 is the most likely date. And if that's true, then by AD 33, Pilate's benefactor, the guy who sort of helped him get his job, was a man named Sejanus, and he was already executed in October of 31 for treason. So it helps us, if we understand the death of Jesus to be in 33 and not 30, that Pilate is probably, at this point, as governor of Judea, on shaky ground with the Romans. If the man who helped get him his job has been executed now by the Romans for treason, it helps to explain why maybe Herod, or Pilate rather, is so willing to give in to the crowd, as we're going to see in a few minutes, in order to sort of save his own neck, to not look like he is treasonous against the Romans. He's already seen Sejanus executed, beheaded for treason by the Romans, and Pilate doesn't want to find himself in that same place. So the high priest, they lead him to the palace of Herod the Great, the Praetorium, where Pilate is. They refuse to come in because it's the Passover. Remember, Passover is not just a day, but it's a week-long celebration. And to enter into the house of a Gentile during Passover would mean that you were unclean, and you would not be able to take the Passover meal. Now, these are high priests, Sanhedrin. They're members of the Jewish religious royalty. they're not going to be unable to take the Passover. It would be a huge shame and dishonor for them if they were to be made unclean. So they remain outside the house. You could come into the courtyard as long as it was not covered. That to be covered would mean that you were inside and thus unclean. So they come into the courtyard so that they won't be defiled, which, again, notice, they are interested in keeping the Passover celebration. These are men that they don't want to miss the Passover meal. They don't want to not be able to take the Passover celebration. So they conspire to make sure that they can not be defiled while they're seeking to have the true Passover lamb put to death. So don't miss the sort of irony there. They are worried about not being defiled by being in a Gentile's house while they're going to great lengths to see the Messiah crucified. That they have just at this point totally missed it. So Pilate, I think, as a way to sort of acquiesce, as a way to try to care for them, and at least not cause trouble, comes out to them rather than making them come all the way in. They come and they make accusations to Jesus and sort of put him before Pilate. They try to focus on Jesus' claim to be king, because they know Pilate doesn't care so much about his claim to be the Messiah. He won't care about the blasphemy claim, but he will care about Jesus as being a king. I want to read to you what Matthew says, Matthew chapter 27, 11 and following. Now it says, "Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus said, 'You have said so.' But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?' But he gave them no answer, not even a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed." That we see that Jesus has this short exchange with Jesus, or with Pilate, where Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You have said so." He gives him an affirmative answer. And the Pharisees, as they're standing there in the courtyard, continue to hail or to hurl accusations at him. And Jesus refuses to answer them. And here we see sort of Pilate's first fascination with Jesus, that he is amazed that Jesus just refuses to answer. He is amazed at Jesus. When he finds out that Jesus is a Galilean, right? We're told that not in Matthew's gospel, but I believe we're told that in Mark's, or rather in Luke's gospel. It says, "But they were urgent, saying to him, 'He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even into this place.'" It says when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. So Pilate, as the Jews are hurling accusations at Jesus and Jesus is refusing to answer, Pilate finds out that Jesus is a Galilean, and he sees in this a chance to sort of free himself of this duty and responsibility. He says, well, if he's Galilean, he's Herod's problem. He falls under Herod's jurisdiction. So then he sends Jesus from the palace of Herod the Great, which is where Pilate would be staying as he's in town for the Passover. He sends him to the palace of Herod Antipas and says, you're Herod's problem, not my problem. So he sends him to Herod. This is the second phase of the Roman trial of Jesus, what we call phase 2 before Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas is the tetrarch. He is literally then ruler of 1/4 of Galilee. He ruled from about 4 BC to AD 39. He's one of Herod the Great's sons, Herod from early in the life of Jesus. That Luke alone sort of gives us the details of Jesus before Herod. Luke says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he long desired to see him, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this they had been at enmity with each other. So Herod wants to see Jesus. We're told by Luke that he's eager to see him, really because he wants to see Jesus do a trick. He wants to see Jesus perform a miracle. And Jesus refuses to answer any of Herod's questions. As Herod tries to ask him questions, Jesus refuses to answer. And growing frustrated with him, Herod and those that are around him, the chief priests and the scribes, they continue to accuse him. And then Herod with his soldiers begins to treat Jesus, Luke says, with contempt, begins to mock him. He ultimately wraps him in splendid clothing, tries to make him look like a king as a sort of a mock royalty. And then he ultimately concludes that he's innocent. And so he sends him back to Pilate. He has nothing to do with him. Though he's frustrated with him and mocks him, he's not going to execute him. And so now we see sort of this ping pong game, right? So he's sent from Pilate to Herod Antipas. Now he's sent from Herod Antipas back to Pilate. And this is the third phase of the Roman trial of Jesus, the final verdict of Jesus as he comes to Pilate for the third time. That Pilate initially determines that Jesus is not guilty. Let's look at what Pilate says, or what Matthew says in Matthew 27, beginning in verse 15. Matthew writes, "Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, probably a zealous guy, a zealot, probably an insurrectionist. And so when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?'" Now Pilate is probably trying to get Jesus off the hook here. He's offering a guy that he knows the Jews probably don't want in hopes that they'll choose Jesus over Barabbas. He says, "For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up." And he knows that what they're doing isn't because Jesus is truly guilty, but because the religious leaders are envious of him. And he says, "Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, 'Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream.'" Now, we don't know much. We get no more details about this dream that Herod's wife has, but she has a dream about Jesus, so much so that she's concerned and sends word to Pilate and says, "Leave him alone. I've had a dream about just this righteous man. He's innocent. I have nothing to do with him." He says, "Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to destroy Jesus." The religious leaders say, "No, everybody ask for they sort of stir the crowd up. Ask for Barabbas and not for Jesus." And so the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Let him be crucified." Now, again, let that sink in. The crowd is saying of Jesus, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." And so when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water, and he washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself." And listen to this. And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." And then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So Pilate's initial verdict here is not guilty. He decides that he wants to punish and release Jesus because he doesn't believe that he's guilty and worthy of death, but the Jewish leaders won't have it. They begin to press more and more and more. Pilate tries to offer Barabbas as a peace offering, that sort of giving them two choices with one that would seem to be so unpleasant, so undesirable that they would have to choose Jesus, and yet they choose Barabbas anyway. The leaders stir up the crowd to choose Barabbas, right? And we often ask, what's the difference, right? Why the change in the crowd? Just a few days earlier in the week, Jesus is being received by crowds. They're calling Hosanna. And so we ask, well, what's the difference in the crowd that's crying Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and this crowd that is saying, "Give us Barabbas, let his blood be on us and on our children"? Well, at least one of the difference is primarily that the crowd at the beginning of the week is primarily disciples and Galileans, and that the crowd here outside the palace of Herod the Great, where Pilate is probably Jerusalemites. All right, it's probably less disciples and more just people who are in Jerusalem, some who have come for the Passover, less disciples of Jesus. And consider that throughout the week, the leaders have continued to sow rumors and division and about Jesus, and so that there were probably some in the crowd that were initially inclined to trust Jesus, but have maybe been turned against him throughout the week, who are thrown off. Now, this Jesus at this point is a man who has been convicted by the religious establishment of blasphemy. So there are many maybe in the crowd who thought maybe this was the Messiah, but he's been convicted of blasphemy, that they want to be, in that sense, on the right side of this issue, the right side, you might say, of history. So Pilate asked him, "What do you want me to do with him?" They cry out, "Crucify him." They continue to press him even further. If you read in John's gospel, that they press Pilate and say that if you let him go, that you are no friend of Caesar's, right? That if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend, that everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar, that they put pressure on Pilate where Pilate is weak. Again, remember, at this point, probably Pilate's benefactor has been executed for treason. That he is probably, even if this is AD 30, probably still on shaky ground with the Romans. He doesn't want to be seen as losing control of his territory, and certainly doesn't want to be seen as entertaining a rebel, one that would think that he is a king. And so they press in. If you're going to allow Jesus to remain and claim to be a king, you're no friend of Caesar's. They press where he's weak. This time, when Pilate speaks to Jesus, he refuses to answer him, right? That Pilate reminds him, right? That, hey, I have the authority of life and death over you. And then Jesus reminds him, you have no authority over me except what has been given to you by my Father. The Jewish leaders began to continually press on Pilate, this time even more politically. I want you to notice in John's Gospel, Pilate says to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priest answered, listen to this, we have no king but Caesar. The chief priests, the Jews in Jerusalem, say to the Roman governor, we have no king but Caesar. This is nothing if not a total repudiation of all of the promises of the Old Testament. For who is the king of the Jews? Who is the king of the people of God? It is God himself. This is what the Old Testament teaches, that God will be their king, that he will send them a Messiah to rule them, to bring the kingdom, that they might live together in the kingdom. And when they say, we have no king but Caesar, they so want Jesus to be dead that they're able to deny and repudiate all the Old Testament promises. We have no king but Caesar. It is shocking. God alone is their king, and yet they refuse to acknowledge the Messiah who stands before them. So this leads us then to the final verdict. The Pilate chooses political expediency rather than what he knows to be right. He believes Jesus to be innocent, believes Jesus not to be worthy of death, but he understands that the situation before him is a powder keg, that it could explode, and it could have damaging consequences, not just for the Jews, but for himself. So he's at this point scared of the potential consequences for him, and he makes a decision to give in to the crowd. He figures that the death of one man, the death of Jesus, is probably worth the peace that it will ultimately bring. So he symbolically, you'll notice in the text, he symbolically washes his hands and says, this man is not my responsibility. Now we have to understand that Jesus is still Pilate's responsibility. Pilate is still responsible. He had the power to stop this, and yet he did not. But symbolically, he wants the Jews to understand that I want to be clean of this man's blood. And then they accept responsibility. Do you notice what Matthew tells us? They cry out, his blood be on us and on our children. Listen, you have probably heard of the death of Jesus, the trial of Jesus, many, many times in your life. When I read this account, I am still chilled to the core at the self-deception of the Jews who cry out, his blood be on us and on our children. They have no idea, no clue what they're asking for. His blood be on us and on our children. It is chilling. The final stage of the trial is when Jesus is scourged. Scourging is sort of a prerequisite to crucifixion, often used, sometimes just independent of it. That it is brutal and violent, hard for us to imagine. That when someone was scourged, they were tied to a post. Their arms were wrapped around the post so that their back was exposed. And then they would take a whip with intertwined pieces of bone and metal, and then they would be whipped repeatedly on their back as the pieces of bone and metal would grip the flesh of the back, and as it was pulled out would just rip open the back, would rip out large chunks, would destroy muscle and cartilage that would expose the back, cause massive blood loss, that many people, when they were scourged, many people died. Many people died either right there or in the days following. Many people never recovered. That even as this was often the preface to crucifixion, some people died from the scourging and never made it to crucifixion. So this is the final verdict. Jesus is condemned to die, that he is beaten with this whip. He's whipped, his back is laid open, and then is about to head towards is about to head towards the crucifixion. Now, we're told that as all this is happening, that John tells us now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. So therefore, it's about noon. And one of the things I want you to see, I'm going to throw this up here. This is also in Kostenberger's book. As John tells us that it was about the 6th hour, so therefore it was about noon. Mark tells us that the final verdict comes at the 3rd hour, which would be 9 o'clock. And you say, well, who's right? Is one of these guys wrong that John says noon and Mark says 9? Well, one of them is wrong. Right now, that this is the day of preparation for the Passover, John says. That the implication there is for the preparation for the Passover meal that would take place on the Sabbath. So Passover happens Thursday evening, and then they would have the Passover meal then. But then, remember, this is a week-long celebration, and so they would prepare a Passover meal for the Sabbath, which during the Passover would be a massive deal. And so they're preparing for that. They're about to slaughter the lambs to prepare for the Passover. John says this verdict comes down at about the time that they're slaughtering the lambs. Now, again, the symbolism here shouldn't be lost on us, that as they're sacrificing the lambs for the Passover meal on the Sabbath, that the Lamb of God, the true Passover lamb, is about to be sacrificed, that these things are happening simultaneously. So how do we make sense of John saying the 6th hour and Mark saying the 3rd hour? Are they wrong? Is this an example of the Gospels being wrong? And I would answer no. When we reckon Jewish time, again, they don't have watches. No one's got their Apple Watch. No, right? They don't. Even at this point, sundials are very, very, very rarely in use. And so, what we know is that the day was reckoned sort of into 4 quadrants, from sunrise to sunset, and just sort of often the markers were the 3rd hour, which is about 9 a.m., the 6th hour, which is about 12 p.m., and then the 9th hour, which is about 3 p.m. Now that's the sort of general markers of the daytime. And so because this is imprecise, Mark and John are looking up and they're looking at the sun and guessing about what time of day it is, that you would sort of use these markers, 3rd, 6th, and 9th, as a sort of rounding up, sometimes a rounding down. So if Mark looks at the sky and he says the 3rd hour could refer from anything to from 8 o'clock-ish, 7:30 maybe even, up until 10:30 or 11, right? The 3rd hour is sort of in this span. And the same thing is true here of the 6th hour. So when someone says it was the 6th hour, that might be anywhere from 1:30-ish to 10:30 or 11. So what is probably the case, as we think about this, is that this happens somewhere in here. And so that Mark rounds down and John rounds up. So that if this happens 10:30 or 11, somewhere in that range, then it's reasonable that Mark would say it would happen about the 3rd hour. And then it's also reasonable that John, seeing the exact same event at the exact same time, could say, this happened, oh man, that looks just awful, I should work on my skills. That John could say, yeah, this happened about the 6th hour. This is not a discrepancy. This is 2 people using what was available to them to describe time frames in an ancient world. Right? No one's able to say, well, this happened at 10:17 a.m. Right? This is not the way they reckon time. And so it happens probably somewhere in between the 3rd and the 6th hour. Mark rounds down, John rounds up. Right? So this is the final verdict of Jesus. He is beaten with a whip, scourged, and then now he's going to be led to Golgotha. Matthew chapter 27, verses 37 through 34. Then the soldiers of the governors took Jesus. I'm going to go ahead and throw this up for you. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail the King of the Jews!" And they spit on him, took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to be crucified. And as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled this man to carry the cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. So we're told that he's led from the palace of Herod the Great, where Pilate is, to Golgotha by an entire battalion of soldiers, 600 soldiers. They mock Jesus. They treat him as if he is a pretend king, and they lead him to Golgotha. They pass out they pass out the garden gate here, go out the second western wall of Jerusalem, and head towards Golgotha. Now, by the time they get to this point, they realize that Jesus is probably unable to carry his cross. This happened often. As they go, the crossbeam would be tied to the man's arms, and he would be forced to carry it, a massive thing, probably 30 to 40 pounds. And you consider at this point that Jesus has been scourged. His back is laid open. He's losing blood. And so they compel a man, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross for him. Simon is from North Africa. That's where Cyrene is. He's probably in town for the Passover. We see this name come up later in the New Testament. So it is presumable that Simon becomes a believer if he was not already a disciple of Jesus. And so he carries the cross as they're taken to Golgotha. Now we're told that as they're on the way, Luke tells us that Jesus sees women weeping for him. And he says to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed. And then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, come cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" That Jesus, even as he's on the way to the cross, the women are weeping, and Jesus pronounces a word of warning. So don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves, for the judgment that is coming, most immediately in AD 70, when the Romans would sack Jerusalem, but ultimately for the judgment that would come when Jesus uses this language, fall on us, calling out to the mountains, fall on us, and the hills cover us. That's Revelation language, that we're told that when the judgment of Christ comes, when Christ returns in judgment, that the wicked of the world will cry out to the mountains, fall on us, for it would be better for the mountain to fall on them than for the judgment of God to fall on them. See, he's led out the western wall. He's led out to a place called Golgotha, a place called the Skull. When he gets there, he's offered wine mixed with gall and myrrh. It's possible that this was often maybe given to those who were crucified as a mild sedative, as a mild painkiller, but Jesus refuses to take it. Now, the question becomes, why was this called the place of the skull? The answer is, we don't know. It could be that's because they did lots of Roman executions there. That's certainly true. Could be because of the many tombs that were around there, which is also true. It could be just simply geography, that the way the hill was positioned, that it looked like a skull. Either way, it's a hill outside of Jerusalem where the execution is to take place. Now, it's important that it be outside of Jerusalem because in order for... So I'll just show you this big picture, just so you can see the entire path of Jesus. It's important that it be outside Jerusalem because you could not be executed in Jerusalem. So Jesus begins the Garden of Gethsemane. He's brought to the palace of the high priest, sent to Pilate, sent to Herod, sent back to Pilate, and then led out the western wall to Golgotha, to the place of his execution, to the place of the skull. Now, when we begin to talk about the crucifixion, we get very few details. Look at what Matthew says. It says, "And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots." It says in Luke, "And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left." Mark tells us, "And they crucified him and delivered his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide which each should take." And John tells us, "And there they crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them." That we get very, very sparse details of the crucifixion of Jesus. It is stated in what you might call brutal simplicity. And there they crucified him. Crucifixion was at this point in history already a Roman favorite for execution. That it could be done on a single stake, but often was done on a single stake with a crossbeam, like Jesus, so that this person's arms would be stretched out. They would be tied to the beam, and then a nail inserted probably in the wrist bone to hold. The hand would more likely tear, but from archaeological evidence, probably here in the wrist bone, so that it would hold well. Nails would be driven through the wrist bones, and then sometimes nails would be driven through the feet, not always, but the feet of Jesus were pierced. So Christ is crucified. He's stretched out on this. He's nailed to the cross. In his right and his left wrist, his feet are put together, tied together, and then nailed to the cross. That crucifixion is one of the most brutal ways that man has ever invented to kill another man. That imagine even just what Jesus has undergone. He's already had his back laid open, and now that back that is just raw and bare bone and meat is now put up against a rough, rugged cross. And he's tied to that cross. He's lost at this point significant blood. He's got a crown of thorns on his head. That many people at this point, when they're crucified, die of just pure physical trauma, just the shock that their body is in, that they don't make it to this point. That they sometimes die very quickly from the shock, the trauma to their body. Some die from lack of blood, that they lose just so much blood in this process, the brutality of what they've undergone, that they die. But ultimately, if they survive those things, the cross ultimately kills you slowly, kills you by suffocation. And in order to breathe as you're on the cross, as you're stretched out, you have to push up with your legs in order to get a deep breath. And so what happens is slow asphyxiation, that over time as the body weakens, as the legs weaken, that you're unable to fully push up. Now again, imagine what that would feel like on your back as you're nailed to a cross and you're having to push up to breathe. It is, I think, impossible for us to overstate what a brutal, physically brutal death this is for any man to endure, much less Jesus, an innocent man, to endure. And the Bible just very simply, they crucified him, and there they crucified him. There they nailed him to the tree. Even the mocking that has happened continues at this point to the very end. That even as Jesus is lifted up on the cross, they continue to mock him. We're told that even those that were beside him mock him. Jesus tells us this, or Luke rather tells us this account of, as the thieves are mocking him, that one thief has this change of heart, that he says to the other, "Don't you fear God? We're here because we deserve it, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he says to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." It is a remarkably simple statement of faith. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. When Jesus says something amazing to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Today. Imagine, Jesus says, imagine a thief saying to a man beside him dying on a cross, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." This man is a king and he's bringing a kingdom. Jesus, simply remember me. And Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." John tells us about Jesus' own care for his mother on the cross. As he tells John to take care of his mother. He says, "Mother, this is your son. Son, this is your mother." We're told that the inscription hung above Jesus is a title that says, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." It's hung in 3 languages. In Aramaic, which is the common language of Palestine. It's hung in Latin, which is the official Roman language. And then it's hung in Greek, which is the sort of international, the trade language of the Roman Empire. That they do this so that it has the widest reading. And the chief priests go to Pilate and say, "We want you to change it. We want you to say that he claimed to be King of the Jews." And yet Pilate says, "What I have written, I have written," that he leaves it. So Jesus is again, just very simply in the text, we're told that he is crucified. And then we hear of the last breaths of Jesus. I'm going to read you what John says. "After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scriptures, 'I thirst.' And a jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, 'It is finished.' And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." Since it was the day of preparation, and so that bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and then the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was actually dead or already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it bore witness, this testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you may believe. For these things took place that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says they will look on him whom they have pierced. So Jesus, as he hangs on the cross, Mark tells us that he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That at the death of Jesus, he's on the cross approximately 6 hours. That darkness covers the land from about noon till 6. That in the Old Testament, darkness had several different meanings. Darkness like this was symbolic for the ignorance of man and their sin. In Isaiah 60, it was symbolic for divine lament, God's lamenting in Amos 8, or divine judgment in Exodus 10, or Amos 5, or Joel 2 and 3. And what we see here at the death of Jesus and the darkness, the supernatural darkness that overtakes the land, is probably a mixture of all three. It is the sin of the people, divine lament over the death of a son, and divine judgment being poured out on his own son, and ultimately on the people. That he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is from Psalm 22:1. This is a reminder to us that as Jesus hung on the cross, that he was in some real way cut off from the Father. Now, the theological dimensions of this are deeper than what we have time to go into in this class. But it is hard for us, and I think maybe to some degree it's ultimately impossible for us to wrap our human brains around how could Jesus, the God-man, the second person of the Trinity, how could he ever in any way be forsaken or cut off from the Father? But Jesus says that it is true, that in some real way, as the Father pours out his wrath on the Son, his wrath that is due sinners, that as he pours that out on his Son, that there is in some way some forsaking, some cutting off of Jesus before the Father. Jesus is crying out in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, which means my God, and some sort of hear this and mistake him and think that he's calling for Elijah. John tells us that he says that I thirst, that is a fulfillment of Psalm 69, that it is clear that at his death that Jesus is still trusting the Father. Now, you'll notice, and Kostenberger lists these out, that there are sort of the last 7 sayings of Jesus that between the 4 Gospels, we sort of get different accountings of the last sayings of Jesus. Now, you might read these things and say, well, the Gospels then are wrong. They disagree about the last thing that Jesus said. I would encourage you to remember everything that we've seen so far as we've worked through these Gospel accounts of the last week of Jesus' life. That each of these writers have not just an agenda to tell the truth, but they have an agenda to present theological truths, that they are all describing the same event from different perspectives. Right? In the same way that when we talked about the issue of time, that Mark and John are both right. That it's not that either is wrong and one is right, is that they're both right. And so they describe, I think, all things that Jesus said, and from their perspective, the last thing that Jesus said. So did Jesus say all of these things? Yes. And so they're describing the last words of Jesus from their perspective. And to the death of Jesus, we have several supernatural phenomenons. One, we're told that the curtain tears in two from top to bottom. Remember, this curtain is a curtain that's in. Throw this picture back up. Right, it's this curtain that is inside the temple. Right, it's in here. It's the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. It is 60 feet high, it's 30 feet wide, it's several inches thick, it's a massive curtain, and it tears into, beginning at the top to the bottom. This is a symbolic gesture that's saying that now, because of the death of Jesus, that God is no longer separated from his people, that there's no curtain that separates the presence of God from the people of God, that's changing now with the death of Jesus. Number 2, there is an earthquake. The earth literally shakes at the death of Jesus. And then Matthew tells us, this thing that Matthew tells us is one of the things that I want to know more about when I get to heaven. And Matthew tells us, and the earth shook, and the rock splits, and tombs also were opened. And many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And Matthew says it and gives us no more details, and then moves on. That Matthew says that at the earthquake, that tombs were opened, and that there was this first fruits of the coming kingdom, that there were some saints who in that moment were resurrected, were given, not like Lazarus, but were given resurrection bodies. Some either Old Testament saints or intertestamental time saints were resurrected from the grave, given resurrected bodies, and appeared to people in Jerusalem, and presumably at some point between this day and the ascension of Jesus, ascended to heaven. You just think that there were other people raised in Jerusalem other than just Jesus. And again, wish we had more detail. You just think, man, Matthew, I wish you would have told us more. But this is, in some way, I want you to think of this as first fruits of the coming resurrection, that the death of Jesus brings about these first fruits of what is going to ultimately be true of everybody in Jesus. The dead in Christ, all the dead in Christ will ultimately be raised. Now, we're told that the side of Jesus was pierced. You notice when I read the Gospels, that we're told that they come around, they need the bodies to be taken off the crosses, and so they break the legs of the other two as a means to keep them from pushing up so that they would die faster. But the bones of Jesus are not broken. There's a prophecy that says the bone of Jesus would not be broken. They see that Jesus is already dead, and so they refuse to break his bones. But instead they pierce him. Now, why did they pierce him? We don't know. Maybe it's just to ensure that he's dead. But they pierce his side, and he is dead, and out flows blood and water. And we're told this is to keep the prophecy from Psalm 34:20, that he keeps all his bones. Not one of them is broken. That this is the death of Jesus described with brutal simplicity in the Scriptures. And then lastly for us today, to end out Friday, is the burial of Jesus. It says, "Now, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. And he went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And then Pilate ordered that it be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in a new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone into the entrance of the tomb and went away. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb." Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, a member of the Sanhedrin, at this point a secret disciple of Jesus, puts himself at risk. He asks for the body of Jesus, which would be a public way of displaying that he was a supporter of Jesus. We know that he's a rich man. He likely gives Jesus a family tomb, that he wraps him in linen shrouds. We're told that Nicodemus comes and helps to prepare the body. This is normally what would happen. He would be wrapped and placed in a tomb, in sort of a cave-ish tomb. And then when the body had to decay, the bones would be gathered and put into what's called an ossuary box. This is for the wealthy. The poor were buried in the ground. We're told that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene both sort of watched this process. They watched the body of Jesus cared for and they watched where he is buried because they planned to come back after the Sabbath. They planned to come back Sunday morning with more spices, more ointments for Jesus to prepare his body even further. They watched where Jesus is laid. And at this, the Son of God is laid in a tomb on a Friday evening, his body broken and beaten and pierced. That Jesus was crucified, dead, and buried. And that's where we end Friday. But it's not where we end the story. Jesus at the end of Friday is crucified, dead, and buried. But Sunday is coming.